Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad the subcommittee is holding this hearing. I appreciate the opportunity to testify here before you about U.S. relations with Cuba. What I'd like to do is summarize my written testimony, make one general point about U.S. relations with Cuba, and then three specific points about U.S. relations with Cuba and their impact on our foreign policy more generally. The general point I'd like to make is that my organization focuses on human rights, on democracy, and social justice in Latin America, on the implications for U.S. policy of those issues. We've done so for more than 30 years. I think if you look at U.S. policy toward Cuba, what we see is that our current policy hurts our domestic political and economic interests, and it's doing nothing to improve the human rights situation in the island while hurting our foreign policy interests in Latin America. Secretary Block talked about, and I'm sure Mr. Brilliant and others will talk about, the economic possibilities we're losing in terms of trade with Cuba, in terms of helping our farmers and our exporters, in terms of helping the travel and tourism industry, at a time when we're trying to increase exports, at a time when we're trying to build jobs in this country. That's not something to be easily dismissed. On the flip side, as Jose Miguel and I'm sure others will point out, there's no question there are real and very serious human rights problems in Cuba itself. Political prisoners, restrictions on political freedom and freedom of expression, freedom of association. The difficulty is that while U.S. policy prevents us from taking advantage of the economic opportunities, it's done nothing to address the human rights problems. And I think in our view, like Mr. Block, the approach exemplified by the Trade Sanctions Reform Act, which looks for greater engagement with Cuba both economically and politically to affect the human rights situation, is the way we ought to be going. So that's the general point I'd like to make, that we ought to have a policy that benefits our economic interests and our foreign policy interests, and that our current Cuba policy doesn't do either. The three specific points. First, sanctions have failed to have much impact on the human rights situation in Cuba, and the flip side of that is that U.S. diplomats and the U.S. government have very little contact with the people in Cuba who might make a difference on human rights, on democracy, and on economic development issues in the future. Cuba is going through, or going to go through in the next decade, a generational change forced by biological necessity. A new generation of leaders will come into Cuba, and very few of those people have had any systematic contact with U.S. government officials or with U.S. diplomats. I was in Cuba in January with a delegation that included some congressional staff. We met with a series of academics, of religious leaders, and of Cuban government officials. When we met with the U.S. interest section, they told us they envied our contact in Cuban society. And I think that's a real problem in terms of our ability to affect the future and influence those who might make decisions in Cuba. So I think from the point of view of influence in Cuba, we ought to be engaged. And I don't think there's something magical about that. I don't think our engagement will transform Cuba from today to tomorrow or lead Cuban leaders to join the League of Women Voters. But I think if we're standing on the sidelines, we're unable to exercise any influence at all, and it's in our interest to move in a new direction. So that's the second point. If we want to affect human rights, we ought to engage with the Cuban government and those who will affect its future. Secondly, our embargo on Cuba drives a wedge between us and other countries in Latin America. As Wayne noted, every country in the hemisphere has normal relations with Cuba. That includes Colombia. It includes a range of staunch U.S. allies. We're the only country here without those relations, and that causes difficulties for us with our allies. Most notably, last December, 32 of the 34 countries in the Western Hemisphere met in Cancun, Mexico. The President of Colombia was there. The President of Venezuela was there. People across the political spectrum. Cuba was there, and the United States was not. And that meeting ended with a call on the United States to end our embargo with Cuba. And I think if we're interested in strengthening our relations across the hemisphere, it's in our interest to do that. I think that's particularly true in the case of Brazil, a potential strategic partner for the United States, and one that's tried to engage with Cuba and has urged us to do the same. And the final point I'd like to make is that we have a series of national security interests in the Caribbean in particular, on drug policy, on drug interdiction, on organized crime, on migration, on human trafficking. We're in the midst of developing a Caribbean regional security initiative and working with governments throughout the Caribbean on that issue. Cuba's a major player in the Caribbean. It's got diplomatic relations with everyone else. If we want to work on those kind of issues, we ought to be at least engaged with Cuba on issues where national security matters. So just to wrap up, I think it's pretty clear our current policy fails to make a difference while hurting us economically, and in particular, it hurts our national security interests, it hurts our relations with our allies, and it hurts our ability to influence events in Cuba. So on all those grounds, I'd urge us to look for a new direction in our Cuba policy. Thank you.